The rain of late autumn swept through Atlanta like a cold veil, blurring the towering lights of the skyscrapers into soft halos. In the heart of Buckhead, the city's most exclusive district, luxury sedans glided silently along wet streets, while pedestrians in tailored suits and velvet dresses hurried under umbrellas, their faces lit by the glow of high-end boutiques. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume mixed with damp concrete, a reminder that this part of the city belonged to those who could afford its polished perfection. Malcolm Jennings pulled his older model black sedan into the valet lane outside L'Etoile, one of Atlanta's most prestigious and hardest-to-book restaurants. At 38, he carried himself with quiet confidence, a long khaki overcoat over a simple white shirt without a tie, dark brown leather shoes that had seen better days, close-cropped hair, and a neatly trimmed beard framing a thoughtful face. To anyone glancing his way, he looked like an ordinary professional seeking a decent meal on a rainy evening. No one in the bustling entrance knew that 10 years earlier, the head chef of this very restaurant had pulled him from a burning building during a warehouse fire, saving his life. And certainly no one knew that Malcolm now held 42% of the shares in the entire chain, making him the majority owner and co-founder who had quietly guided its rise to acclaim. He simply wanted a peaceful dinner. The revolving glass doors spun smoothly as he stepped inside. Warm light spilled from crystal chandeliers onto marble floors, and the subtle aroma of truffle oil and fresh herbs drifted from the open kitchen. Soft jazz played in the background, mingling with the low hum of conversation from tables filled with Atlanta's elite executives in designer suits, socialites with diamond earrings catching the light, couples celebrating anniversaries over bottles of vintage Bordeaux. Malcolm approached the hostess stand where Brielle Sanders stood poised behind a sleek iPad. 24 years old, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a flawless low bun, crimson lips, and a fitted black blazer that accentuated her figure, she scanned each arriving guest with the practiced eye of someone curating an exclusive event. Her gaze flicked up briefly as Malcolm neared. "Good evening," he said politely, his voice calm and measured. "I have a reservation for 2 at 7:45. Name's Malcolm Jennings." Brielle didn't look up immediately. "You're a bit early. You can wait over there." "I'm sorry, but Only then did she raise her eyes. They traveled quickly from his worn leather shoes to the absence of a luxury watch, lingering on the simple khaki coat and the dark skin beneath it. She tapped the iPad screen with manicured nails. "No listing." "Are you sure you booked the right location? I have the confirmation email." "It happens sometimes," she replied with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "People mix us up with the Midtown branch." Malcolm pulled out his phone and opened the email. "L'Etoile Buckhead. 7:45 p.m. Table 14. Notes. Preference for red wine, no seafood." He turned the screen toward her. Brielle glanced at it, then lowered her voice, almost whispering. "We're very sorry. The table was canceled. Probably a system glitch." Malcolm looked past her into the dining room. Table 14, a prime corner spot near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked street, was empty. A server was carefully placing polished silverware on crisp white linens. "What about that one?" he asked quietly, nodding toward it. "That's VIP. Not for walk-ins." "I'm not a walk-in." She met his eyes directly for the first time. "You understand," she said, her tone final. "We're fully booked. Thank you." The words, the glance, the deliberate omission of Sir Everything carried the weight of a verdict delivered without raising her voice. Malcolm took one step back. The rain pattered against the windows behind him as he opened an internal management app on his phone, one accessible only to senior stakeholders. A few taps brought up the reservation log. Table 14, reserved, Malcolm Jennings. Canceled at 7:26 p.m., operator Brielle Sanders. Reason does not meet customer image standards. He stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Customer image standards. He looked up. Brielle was touching up her lipstick using her phone's camera, oblivious. "Miss Brielle," he said evenly, "I have one small question." Brielle turned back slowly, her polished smile faltering for the first time as she realized Malcolm hadn't moved. He stood there calm and unmoving, the phone still held out toward her. "Yes," she asked, forcing politeness into her voice. "Is there something else?" Malcolm tilted the screen so she could see it clearly. The reservation log glowed under the soft lighting of the hostess stand, table 14, reserved under his name. Canceled at exactly 7:26 p.m., 20 minutes before he arrived. Operator Brielle Sanders. Reason does not meet customer image standards. Her eyes widened. Color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her looking almost ghostly under the warm chandeliers. That must be a mistake," she stammered, glancing around as if someone might rescue her. "I didn't." Malcolm lowered the phone but kept his gaze steady. "You canceled my reservation yourself," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest tables. "You didn't verify. You didn't ask questions. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong." Brielle's fingers tightened around the edge of the iPad. "Sir, you have to understand this place has a certain standard we maintain. And that standard," Malcolm replied, "doesn't include a black man in a khaki coat. No, that's not what I meant." But her voice cracked, betraying her. A few guests at nearby tables had stopped mid-conversation, forks hovering, eyes shifting toward the exchange. Malcolm tapped the screen again and turned it back toward her. This time it showed the internal shareholder portal. His name sat prominently at the top. Malcolm Jennings, 42% ownership. Co-founder, board member. Brielle stared at the screen as if it were written in a language she couldn't comprehend. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The dining room grew quieter. A woman in a red silk dress leaned toward her companion. A man in a navy suit lowered his wine glass. Whispers began to ripple outward. "Isn't Jennings the one who funded half the independent restaurants after the pandemic?" "That's him!" Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket and raised his voice just enough for the entire front of the restaurant to hear, clear, controlled, without anger. "You didn't just insult me tonight," he said. "You insulted every person who has ever stood in this exact spot and been judged before they could even speak. And I promise you this will not happen again in a restaurant I helped build." A hush fell over the room. Silverware paused against plates. The jazz track in the background seemed to fade as though someone had instinctively turned it down. From the back, Alicia Ramos, the general manager, emerged quickly, her heels clicking against the marble. Her face was pale, eyes wide with recognition and dread. "Mr. Jennings," she said, voice tight. "I had no idea you were—" He turned to her, expression unreadable. "Alicia," he said, cutting her off, gently but firmly. "I want a full review of hostess conduct regarding discrimination, starting with this incident, and right now, I want to know who is responsible for allowing this to become acceptable." Alicia glanced at Brielle, who was now gripping the stand to steady herself, then back at Malcolm. Around them, the restaurant had gone unnaturally still. No one reached for their wine. No one checked their phone. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The air in L'Etoile thickened as if the room itself had drawn a sharp breath and forgotten to exhale. Crystal glasses hung motionless halfway to lips. Forks rested against porcelain without a clink. Even the soft jazz from the hidden speakers seemed to fade, note by note, until only silence remained. Brielle Sanders stood frozen behind the host to stand her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the iPad. Tears welled in her eyes, smudging the perfect line of mascara into dark streaks down her cheeks. She stared at Malcolm's phone as though the words on the screen might rearrange themselves if she looked long enough. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. If I had known who you were, Malcolm's expression didn't change. He spoke calmly, but every word landed with unmistakable weight. That's exactly the problem, he said. You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. He turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep across the dining room. Dozens of faces watched him. Some curious, some uncomfortable, a few openly sympathetic. The rain outside tapped steadily against the tall windows, the only sound in the room. You looked at me. He continued, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear, and decided I didn't belong here. Not because I was rude, not because I couldn't pay, but because in your mind, a black man dressed like this doesn't fit your idea of who should walk through these doors. Brielle's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Malcolm faced Alicia Ramos, who now stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Alicia, he said, I want to see every guest complaint filed in the last 6 months, right now. Alicia hesitated only a second before nodding to an assistant. A tablet was brought forward within moments. Malcolm scrolled through the entries, his jaw tightening as he read. The notes repeated like a pattern no one had bothered to hide. Guest complained about hostess attitude. Reservation canceled last minute despite confirmation. Guest of color. Casually dressed guest. Younger guest. Not the occasional mistake. A system. He looked up, addressing the entire room. Tonight, you're not just witnessing one incident, he said. You're seeing the truth that many people have carried quietly for months. A middle-aged black man at a table near the window set down his glass and stood. I was treated the exact same way 2 weeks ago, he said, his voice firm. I didn't speak up because I didn't want to make a scene. A young woman at a nearby table, her birthday tiara still sparkling under the lights, raised her hand slightly. I booked a table for my husband's birthday, she said. They told me it was fully booked. I watched 3 empty tables sit unused the entire night. Another voice joined from the bar, a Latino man in a simple button-down shirt. I've been coming here for years. Last month they suddenly lost my reservation. I left without saying anything. One by one, guests spoke up, not shouting. Not angry, just tired of staying silent. Stories of subtle dismissals, canceled bookings, sidelong glances. The room once filled with light conversation and clinking glasses now carried only the weight of shared truth. Malcolm listened without interrupting. When the voices finally quieted, he spoke again. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for trusting this room with your experiences, and I'm sorry, not as a guest tonight, but as someone who helped build this place and allowed this to go on far too long. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was listening. Malcolm turned back toward Brielle and Alicia, his decision already clear in his eyes. The room waited breath, held for what would come next. Malcolm turned his attention fully to Brielle, who now leaned heavily against the hostess stand, barely able to stand upright. What were you hired to do? He asked, his tone even but direct. Brielle swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. To to greet guests. No, Malcolm replied. You were hired to represent what this restaurant stands for. He faced the room again, his voice carrying easily through the stillness. L'Etoile was built by people who were once turned away. Our head chef spent 10 years washing dishes before anyone gave him a chance. My first manager slept in her car to make ends meet. And He paused. Letting the words settle, was once told to leave a restaurant because my shirt didn't have a brand name on it. Eyes widened around the room. A few guests exchanged glances, recognizing the weight behind the story. Real power, Malcolm continued, doesn't come from $1,000 dresses or exclusive reservations. It comes from how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. He turned back to Alicia. Alicia, effective immediately. Brielle Sanders' employment is terminated. Alicia drew a slow breath. Yes, Mr. Jennings. Brielle let out a choked sob. Please, I only did what every high-end place does. Malcolm shook his head. No, you did what you chose to do. And tonight you face the consequences of that choice. Alicia stepped forward and read the termination notice aloud, clearly, professionally, in front of every guest in the dining room. There was no private office, no quiet exit. The decision was made in the open, the same space where the discrimination had occurred. As Brielle gathered her belongings and walked toward the door, her heels echoing on the marble, a sound rose from the tables. Not cheers, not jeers. Applause. Steady, respectful, the sound of people acknowledging that justice had finally been served in plain sight. Malcolm raised a hand gently to quiet it, then addressed the room once more. Tonight, he said, every guest in this restaurant will have their meal comped. Not because of guilt, but because every one of you deserves to be here regardless of how you look, what you wear, or what anyone behind a podium thinks you're worth. A murmur of surprise rippled through the tables, followed by nods and quiet expressions of gratitude. Servers who had been standing frozen began to move again, their steps lighter. Malcolm looked at the remaining staff lined along the walls. Thank you, he said to them, for staying and doing your jobs with dignity tonight. He then turned and walked toward table 14, the one Brielle had declared off limits. As he approached, a young server hurried over, hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the chair. Sir, I'm so sorry about everything. Malcolm offered a small, genuine smile. Thank you for still being here and doing what you do. He sat down alone at the corner table, the city lights shimmering through rain-streaked windows behind him. His phone buzzed repeatedly on the linen cloth videos of the confrontation, already spreading across social media. Comments poured in. I've been treated like that too many times. Finally, someone with power said something. This is what real leadership looks like. Malcolm silenced the notifications and looked out at the room. Conversations had resumed, but they were different now, freer, warmer. People of every background spoke comfortably without the subtle tension that had lingered before. This, he realized, was the L'Etoile he had always envisioned. The night was far from over, but something important had already changed. Malcolm sat alone at table 14, the corner spot that had been declared too exclusive for him only an hour earlier. The city lights outside the tall windows shimmered across wet pavement, casting fractured reflections onto the white tablecloth. A single candle flickered in a glass holder, its flame steady despite everything that had just unfolded. The young server approached again, this time with a menu he clearly didn't expect Malcolm to need. His hands trembled slightly as he set down a fresh glass of water. Mr. Jennings, I truly am sorry for everything that happened tonight. Malcolm looked up and offered a quiet smile. You have nothing to apologize for. Thank you for staying and doing your job well. The server nodded gratefully and retreated, leaving Malcolm in the soft hum of a room slowly returning to life. Conversations had restarted, but they carried a different tone now, lower, warmer, threaded with relief and quiet solidarity. Laughter came easier. Strangers at neighboring tables exchanged glances that acknowledged what they had all witnessed. His phone vibrated insistently against the linen. He glanced at the screen. Videos of the confrontation were already spreading, grainy clips filmed from nearby tables shared across social media with captions that spread like wildfire. This is what accountability looks like. I felt invisible in places like this my whole life. Finally, someone with real power stood up. Malcolm silenced the notifications and set the phone face down. He didn't need to watch. He had lived it. He ordered simply a glass of red wine, the grilled salmon, no appetizers. Not because he couldn't afford indulgence, but because tonight he wasn't here for the food. As the meal arrived, he ate slowly, watching the room. A black couple at a center table raised their glasses to him subtly. A young Latino family near the bar smiled when he met their eyes. An older white woman dining alone nodded with quiet respect. The barriers that had existed unspoken but always felt had thinned, if only for one evening. This, Malcolm realized, was the L'Etoile he had dreamed of when he first invested in it years ago, a place where excellence didn't require exclusion. Near the end of the meal, he stood once more. The room quieted almost instinctively, conversations trailing off as guests turned toward him. "L'Etoile will change," he said, his voice carrying easily without a microphone. "Not just because of what happened tonight, but starting tomorrow, every staff member will undergo renewed training on inclusion and respect. Every hiring practice will be reviewed, and anyone who places prejudice above kindness will no longer have a place here." He paused, letting the words settle. "I want to thank all of you for speaking up, for bearing witness, and for reminding us what this restaurant can be when we choose decency over appearance." He inclined his head in a small, sincere bow. Applause rose again, warm and sustained, filling the space where tension had lived only hours before. When Malcolm finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner, sharper. Streetlights reflected in puddles like scattered stars along the sidewalk. He paused under the awning, breathing in the cool night. He knew there were countless other places like L'Etoile had been tonight. Gatekeepers with clipboards and quiet judgment systems that protected comfort over fairness. Change wouldn't come everywhere at once, but it could start somewhere. One person willing to speak, one moment refusing to stay silent, one room full of people choosing to listen. And tonight a single table once reserved for privilege had become a symbol of something far greater. It belonged at last to justice. As Malcolm walked toward his car, the city lights stretched ahead of him, bright, open, and full of possibility. He didn't look back. There was no need. The message had already been delivered.